Over the course of this class, we have seen many similarities between different myths. These myths originate from different continents and different time periods, and yet a vast number of them have something in common: the Great Flood. In this video, I will attempt to explain why these myths share such an interesting motif. Although many of the stories we've read in class had the Great Flood motif, I was surprised by just how many flood stories there were throughout the world. I found a website by Mark Isaac, who has compiled a list of over 100 flood stories from around the world. After skimming this list, I realized that I was onto something. It's a very unique motif that somehow has made its way into many myths. I first set out to research if there was any truth to these flood stories. Did they actually happen? And what was the scale of these floods? I mainly focused on the Genesis flood, as there was the most scientific research done on this particular story. I managed to find a research paper that talked about just that. Lawrence Collins at CSUN wrote an article based on geological evidence that addressed the question of a global flood. They used evidence from the depositions from evaporate rock salt, as they have a very predictable order in which they deposit themselves. Since floods are mostly comprised of seawater, they contain a lot of dissolved ions. The heavy ions deposit first, and the lighter ones deposit later. If there was a worldwide flood, there should be a band in the Earth's crust that contains these ions in the same exact order across all continents. This, however, is not the case. The fact that these rock salt deposits are not consistent points to a cycle of floods occurring over centuries, rather than one large flood and drying of the Earth. With this evidence, we can definitively conclude that there was no global flood that happened. And then I thought, maybe there was just a large flood that happened in the Mesopotamian region, and due to the enormity of the flood, it looked to them like the entire Earth was flooded. So I did some more research, and I found a paper published by Phil Center, which analyzed the formation of the Ararat Mountains and evidence of floods. The Ararat Mountains are the mountain chain that Noah's Ark was reported to land on. He analyzed geological strata and the paleontological evidence in it to conclude that there was no large floods after the Ararat Mountains had formed. This mountain chain formed through volcanic activity and is very easily dated through geological evidence. With the evidence of diversification of species of tiny sea creatures that had later turned into chalk, Center was able to conclude that there was no large flood that could have happened after the Ararat Mountains were formed, and rather there were many smaller floods. This is very significant because it disproves that there was a large flood in the time of Noah. After seeing the scientific side of this argument, it was not clear to me as to why so many myths include great floods. However, through my own logic, it kind of made sense that all of these ancient civilizations experienced floods, as they were usually geographically close to rivers or large bodies of water. With my scientific research only yielding the answer of no, it didn't happen, I was still confused as to why the Great Flood motif was so prevalent in myths around the world. I came upon an article on a website called The Big Think, where they proposed two interesting theories. The first and more likely theory is that since all humans originate from the same geographical region in sub-Saharan Africa, it would have been a melting pot of all of the ideas that humans have had about mythology. And then from this, when humans migrated to the rest of the world, we carried the ideas about mythology that we had known about from the beginning. The second theory is that humans have psychologically always had the idea of God with them, and through similar experiences, a lot of populations included the Great Flood in their myths. This theory was also popularized by a prominent Swiss psychologist named Carl Jung. Carl Jung said that humans believe in religion as a means to be whole. Jung's approach to the human psyche's need for religion reminded me of one of the theorists that we talked about in class, Malinowski. As we learned, part of Malinowski's theory was that myth provided a fulfilling objective in life. Although the experts in the article said that the latter theory was less likely, I have been growing more accustomed to it as I have worked on this project. I think that it is very possible that through similar experiences with floods, different populations could have had run-in with the flood, and because of the significant damage and loss of life they can cause, they were included in myth. This is the theme of another article I found. A reporter published the highlights of her interview with Patrick Nunn, a geology professor who has written about the effect of floods on human populations. He argued that these types of events are life-altering for many generations down the line, and were thus well preserved in oral history. I also believe that floods are literally symbolic, because even though they can cause damage, they also symbolize a washing of the earth and starting clean. We have seen the washing clean symbolism in some of the myths that we have read. For example, in Quiche Maya, the gods used floods to wipe the slate clean after they had messed up the human design. Although there are many examples of flood stories all across the globe, it does not necessarily mean that there were floods in those regions. As we have studied the migration of myth across Europe and Asia, we saw that some key elements of myth were well preserved. I believe that the Great Flood was one of those key elements, and has stuck in oral history as it has been passed down through generations and across the world. It serves as a warning for the damage that they can cause, and it also symbolizes a cleansing of the earth.